All right. Hey, one other announcement today. Today is Wesley's 87th birthday. And so we want to make sure that we remember him. Happy birthday, old man. And not everybody gets to 87 and look as spry as you do. Okay, well then never mind. No birthday wishes. No, I think he's about 16 or 17. Hey, welcome to Calvary Chapel. Christian kind of covered some of it about welcoming visitors, but I want to just kind of add a couple of more layers to it because it really is our desire to have you feel welcome, whether, for example, last week was the holiday weekend and we had a lot of people passing just visiting from out of town. We wanted them to feel just as home as anybody else that was in the building for that time that they were here. And so we really do desire that, whether you're looking for a church home or you think you found one or you're just visiting. We're really glad to have you with us. And it would be sweet. I mean, you might have plans. Okay, we get that. But if you don't, you're going to have to eat anyway. So you might as well eat here. Because as you can see, Calvary Chapel people know how to cook good food, okay? They don't call us Calvary Chapel for nothing. So please stay and enjoy that food and fellowship afterwards. I would like to meet you if we haven't had the opportunity, so we could do that maybe during the potluck or at the conclusion. I'll be standing at the back of the auditorium, and if you can't stay, maybe you could swing by and just say hi before you run out. But we would ask whether you can stay or not. If you wouldn't mind, please filling out a visitor's card. You see them right in front of you. You could fill it out, and then you could hand it to one of the guys or gals wearing the maroon shirts with the embroidered usher thing on their pocket, and then they'll know how to take it from there. So that would be great. By the way, Christian mentioned the weather. Yesterday was really, I haven't done this in a long time, but it was really, really good weather yesterday. Especially a little bit south of here, a little bit east, over around Memorial Stadium, there on Owen Field. It was just really, really good weather down there yesterday. Beautiful weather. Yes, sir, beautiful weather for football. So, let's begin. We are continuing our study of Matthew. We've kind of slowed down quite a bit as we've gotten into the Sermon on the Mount because there's just so much richness that's contained in it. And we're going to pick up in the 6th chapter with verse 15 this morning. And last week we ended with Jesus giving us a teaching that could basically be summarized as forgiveness begets forgiveness. If we are forgiven, then we will be forgiving. And a lot of these things that Jesus is talking about is very practical, very applicational in our lives. But the problem is we oftentimes get our priorities all mixed up. We might start off well, but then things happen and we're on this priority road where everything is sweet and smooth sailing, and then something happens and we go off course a little bit. And it's primarily because we get our priorities mixed up because you can say we want to have our cake and eat it too. And that can oftentimes cause us to misplace our priorities. For example, this man was walking down the beach and he comes across an old brass oil lamp. And so, of course, he picks it up and begins rubbing it pretty vigorously, and then out pops the genie. And the genie says to him, he says, "Thank you for freeing me from the lamp. In return, I'm going to grant you 3 wishes. And so the guy says, "Great, I've always dreamed of something like this happening, and I already don't know what I want." He says, "First of all, I want $1 billion to be deposited into a Swiss bank account." Genie says, "Fine," and there was this flash of light, and then all of a sudden, he handed him a piece of paper with the account numbers for a Swiss bank account of $1 billion into his hand. And the guy said, "Okay, next, I want a brand new Ferrari." The genie says, no problem. There was a flash of light, and then all of a sudden there was this bright, brand new Ferrari 296 GTB right in front of him. He says, finally, I want to be irresistible to women. So the genie nodded, and there was a flashlight, and he turned him into a box of chocolates. That's a pretty good illustration about how sometimes when we get our priorities mixed up, we can get derailed pretty easily. And in this chapter, chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, as we've repeated, I've been repeating it every week, that it's been called, rightly so, I think, the Sermon of Sermons. And in this chapter, chapter 6, at least the first 15 verses, Jesus talked about doing charitable deeds, how we shouldn't do it for just so that everybody can say what a charitable person we are. Just do it between us and the Lord. And then he also talked about prayer, same sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with public prayer, but if we pray publicly in order to impress people with what good prayers we are, Jesus says you just keep it in your prayer closet. And then that was in the first 15 chapters. Now, in the verses that we are intending on covering this morning, he's going to be addressing a couple other issues, fasting and money. And all four of these things, charitable deeds, prayer, fasting, and our finances, all four of them are addressed in the Old Testament, or as the Hebrews would call the Tanakh. They're all addressed in that, but somehow over the years they had kind of lost their spiritual punch. A lot of things kind of crept in, and even though they would be, they didn't have Bibles that they could put on their phones and carry around with them, and back pockets and that sort of thing. But they learned the scriptures when they would be going to Shabbat school. They learned the scriptures, but they would be reinterpreted by the rabbis, and it just had lost a lot of what it had been over the centuries. It had lost what the Lord had intended it to be. And so the Lord is trying to recapture, he's trying to kind of reel them back in and take them back to what had been first handed down by, and the Tanakh is oftentimes called the Law and the Prophets, what had been given to them through the Law and the Prophets. But his word sounded very radical to the ears of his disciples as he was giving this to them. It sounded very brand new to them, even though it wasn't. You've heard it said, but I say, Jesus says. And he wasn't saying something brand new. He wasn't contradicting the law. He was contradicting the rabbinical interpretation of the law. And so he would say, you've heard it said, but I say. And then he would say what the rabbi should have been saying all along. And it sounded very radical to their ears. And if we think of the meaning of the word radical comes from the Latin word radix, which means root, like the root on a tree or a plant. And he was trying to take them back to when he would say these things to them, he was trying to take them back to their roots. So it was radical in that regard. And he says in verse 16 of chapter 6, moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they got their reward. Under the Mosaic covenant of the Old Testament, there was really only the fasting. It was only commanded one day out of the year. Out of the whole calendar, there was really only one thing in the Mosaic covenant that told them to fast. We find it in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29, where Moses writes, the Lord dictates to Moses, this shall be a statute for you, forever for you. In the 11th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls and do no work at all, whether a native of your own country or a stranger who dwells among you. And then it's also covered in some other places that you see here on the slide. Always talking about this same event. It is reiterated several times in Leviticus and Numbers. And this phrase, afflict your souls, was immediately interpreted. I mean, from the very beginning, they saw that as a Bibleese euphemism for fasting. But that was the only time they had to do it, was when the Lord said to do it, was on that day, the Day of Atonement, the day when they were supposed to stop and think about their spiritual lives and make any adjustments that needed to be made. You know, if maybe there was something that they had forgotten to take to the Lord through a sacrifice, that they could do it on the Day of Atonement, and so forth. There are several other examples in the Old Testament where individuals observed fasting. You know, they did it on their own. Moses, remember when he went 40 days and 40 nights getting the law, and then he brought it down and saw it when they saw the people worshiping the calf, and he took the Ten Commandments, threw it down, broke it, and they ground up the Ten Commandments, and he had to go back up and get some more. And he spent another 40 days and 40 nights. So actually, it appears from the text anyway that he went 80 days and 80 nights without food and water, which obviously would have been a miracle. But then there's David. Remember when he had that illegitimate child through Bathsheba, the son, who had gotten sick. And David was fasting as he was entreating the Lord to heal the baby. And there's several other examples where people would fast for various reasons. Hannah fasted oftentimes as she would pray that the Lord would bring a son to her, and the Lord did in the person of Samuel. But they weren't told to do that. This was just some of the Old Testament saints would fast for the purpose of trying to have their prayer life focus completely on whatever the issue was that they were bringing before Him. But by the time we get to the New Testament era, many of even the faithful had brought in a lot of various commemorative fast days. The death of Gedaliah toward the end of the time of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. With the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple, when the Babylons in 586 had carried the last of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah, the majority of them, into captivity. On the 9th of Av, and if you're very familiar with that, there have been several very tragic events in the history of Israel that have taken place on that day. So even today, the 9th of Av is a very major holiday or memorial of fasting and prayer with the Jewish people. So fasting is something that's very common. We get to the first century, and it was something that was done very readily among the spiritual elite. And this is what Jesus is wanting to address. But before we get into the text, I want to read a section from the Old Testament, from Isaiah. And I think it's he wrote around 750 years. The prophet Isaiah, he prophesied and wrote his what we know as the book of Isaiah about 750 years before Jesus' ministry. And as we're going to see when we read this text, that the Jewish leadership really hadn't learned much in this 3/4 of a millennia between Isaiah and Jesus. And I think most people think that the prophet Isaiah spoke in King James English. But I would suggest to you that he didn't. I think I got a pretty good idea that he spoke in the New Living Translation, English. And you'll see why as we go through it here. Isaiah 58, the first 8 verses, reading from the NLT. Shout with the voice of a trumpet blast. Shout aloud. Don't be timid. Tell my people Israel of their sins. Yet they act so pious. They come to the temple every day and seem delighted to learn all about me. They act like a righteous nation that would never abandon the laws of its God. They ask me to take action on their behalf, pretending they want to be near me. We have fasted before you, they say. Why aren't you impressed? We've been very hard on ourselves, and you don't even notice it. Well, I'll tell you why, I respond. It's because you are fasting to please yourselves. Even while you fast, you keep oppressing your workers. What good is fasting when you keep on fighting and quarreling? This kind of fasting will never get you anywhere with me. You humble yourselves by going through the motions of penance, bowing your heads like reeds bending in the wind. You dress in burlap and cover yourselves with ashes. Is that what you call fasting? Do you really think this will please the Lord? No, This is the kind of fasting I want. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free, and remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry, and give shelter to the homeless. Give clothing to those, or clothes to those who need them, and do not hide from relatives who need your help. Then your salvation will come like the dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal, and your godliness will lead you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. In many versions of the Bible, in this section of the Old Testament, it's called God's Chosen Fast. The heading will be called God's Chosen Fast. And there's nothing in God's Chosen Fast that says anything about going without food. Not to say that that would be eliminated, but I would cause you to notice that it's more about the actions that you take while you're fasting that would be more important than the fasting itself. So Jesus, back to our text in Matthew, he says, don't do it the way that the Pharisees do it, but you, verse 17, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, but to your Father who is in the secret place. And you and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. You know, what they would do in those days is the Pharisees and the scribes and the leaders, the Jewish leadership, if you will, they would like to stand on street corners or walk up and down the streets, and their hair would be flying all over the place, because in those days it was very customary for them to take olive oil and put on they would groom themselves by using olive oil. You could say it was the Brill cream of the first century. Okay, everybody over 40, explain to everybody under 40 what I just said, okay? But they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't groom themselves, and they would wear old clothing, and they would look in the mirror and put on their, get dressed with their various sad, emaciated look that they could, and then he walked up and down the street so that people would go, oh, look at Rabbi Huzitz. He is really righteous because he's been fasting. And Jesus said, don't do it that way. Instead, when you're fasting, use the Brill cream on your hair, wear your best clothes, and kind of stick out your stomach while you're walking down the street so you look like you're well fed. Hide the fasting, because that's between you and me. It's not that it's wrong to know when somebody's fasting. It's not wrong when we would, as a group, there have been many times where people have said, if you would like to join me in I'm going to be fasting during a certain time for a certain such and such a reason. There's nothing wrong with that. The idea of what Jesus is saying is just like the other examples that we've had so far in the Sermon on the Mount, is he says, make sure that you're doing it for the Lord, not for people. Make sure that your heart is right, that your priorities are right, that you're not doing it for the wrong reason. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a 19th century, or first half of the 19th century, he was a very well-known author in those days, and he said it this way. He says, no man for any considerable period can wear a face to himself and another to the multitude without finally getting bewildered as to which one may be true. We talked about masks earlier in the chapter, and how we put on masks to hide who we really are. And that's what Nathaniel's talking about here. And the thing of it is, when people are living hypocritically, they oftentimes can get themselves fooled. The best con is the one that believes his own press. And they can oftentimes drag themselves into their hypocritical conning and believe it themselves, but it's usually pretty evident to everybody else what's going on. Hypocrites maybe get fooled, but those around them usually don't. And hypocritical living in this regard, let's just say in this area of fasting, for example, when we're trying to put on a spiritual front when we're not really being spiritual in our hearts and in our actions before the Lord, that kind of prevents us from truly knowing God and His strength and His presence in our lives. We don't get that punch from Holy Spirit-filled living when we're trying to live that way. And as a result of that, then we kind of rob ourselves of being effective tools in his hands, right? And not that it keeps us from heaven, because we're saved by the grace of Jesus, not by how much righteous fasting we do versus the unrighteous fasting. It's not that, but it can rob us from rewards that we would get in heaven, right? You know, and so what we learn from this, from chapter 6 so far, is that even hypocrites can be charitable. They can pray, and they can look pretty righteous in public, and yet they're not saved. You know, these guys that were putting on all that religious posing, they didn't really belong to the Lord. And so if a hypocrite who looks and walks and talks like the real deal, they give a lot of money to the poor, they pray really good King James prayers, and they know how to put on the right face when they're being religious. If they're not going to be going to heaven, how much more so those who are not doing all that stuff if they don't know the Lord? In other words, what's the difference between being a hypocrite in hell or being a non-hypocrite in hell? So with verse 19, then we come to the subject of money. My New King James has the heading wealth for this section. Talk about wealth. Do not, he says in verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. The word lay up here, where he says do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, the word lay up there is the word thesarizo. And it's the verb form of the noun thesaurus, which our word thesaurus comes from. And the noun of it means treasure. You know, if we were digging out in the backyard and we found this pirate chest full of gold doubloons, you know, that would be a thesaurus for us. And our English word thesaurus means it actually literally means a treasury of words, you know, and that's where you can look up words and get all the synonyms and definitions and etymology and that sort of thing. It's a treasury of words. But in the first century, the word just simply meant treasure. And literally what it is, he's got the noun form and the verb form. He says literally it would be, do not treasure up for yourselves treasures. That's literally what Jesus is saying to them. For, he says in verse 21, passage that most of us are pretty familiar with, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think it was John Corson that I heard say many years ago that we often think of the offering plate or the agape box, if you will. And in fact, I've heard this in a lot of messages, and I've probably even said something along these lines myself when the subject would come up. But John said we often think of the offering box or the agape box, offering plate, agape box, as it's a way that God raises money. And, you know, there's time, I mean, my goodness, do we hear some of that being stretched to, how far can you stretch that, you know, and they keep on stretching anyway. Yeah. God can't do this work unless you do your part, you know. God needs you right now. I see some of those commercials on TV for these quasi-charities that just grates me when I hear them, because I know where 90% of the money's going. But it's not God's way of raising money. According to John Corson, it's God's way of raising us. This issue of money and finances and how our stewardship is associated with that. It's a way that he takes us and grows us and matures us. It's his way of raising us up. And I think another misconception we oftentimes have about this issue is that we think of materialism as something that is usually reserved for that's primarily indulged by the upper crust, privileged people with higher incomes. People that can wear a lot of bling and turn heads when they walk by. And obviously, people of that economic persuasion can be very materialistic. But I think we'd also, most of us anyway, would agree that that urging that we have within us, this desire to want to have something that's more than what God provides for us. We want to strive and connive to get more, is fairly universal to all economic levels, right? For where your treasure is, look at verse 21 again. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It seems to me, when I read that verse, it seems to me that the logical thing Jesus would have said was, for where your heart is, that's where your treasure is going to be, right? If your heart's on me, then that's where you're going to put your treasure. If your heart's on the world, then that's where you're going to put your treasure. If your heart's on yourself, then that's where you're going to put your treasure. That would seem like a logical statement, but he doesn't say it that way. He doesn't say where your heart is, that's where your treasure is going to be. He says where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. Isn't that interesting? We can choose where we place our heart. Because where our treasure is, that's where our heart's going to be. Wherever we make our investment, then our heart is going to follow that. That seems to be what Jesus is saying to me. So the question is, where's my heart? If I can choose where my heart's going to be, and it's going to be manifested by where I make my investments, if you will, where's my heart? Now, I don't think Jesus is not talking about planning for the future. He's not talking about making investments to plan for the future, or 401ks, or any of the other annuities or various investment opportunities that people have. It's not going to a financial advisor and getting help on how to do that sort of thing. He's not talking about any of that. He's just talking about where we place our treasure. That's where our heart's going to be. There was a guy back in the latter part of the 17th century he was a Catholic archbishop in France. His name was Francois Fenelon, and usually just kind of known by his last name. But check out what he says here. He says, "Tell God all that is in your heart, as one unloads one's heart, its pleasures and its pains to a dear friend. Tell God your troubles, that God may comfort you. Tell God your joys, that God may sober them. Tell God your longings, that God may purify them. Tell God your dislikes, that God may help you conquer them. Talk to God of your temptations, that God may shield you from them, and show God the wounds of your heart, that God may heal them. If you thus pour out all your weaknesses, needs, and troubles, there will be no lack of what to say. Talk out of the abundance of the heart without consideration. Say just what you think. Blessed are they who will attain such familiar, unreserved intercourse with God." I think if we take our investment, our tangible investment, and put it into that which is intangible. And again, I'm not talking about not making plans for the future. I think it would be very irresponsible for somebody to say, I don't need to plan for the future because the rapture is going to happen by next Friday. I think that's a pretty irresponsible outlook. But I think when we take our treasures, our tangible treasures, and we invest them into the intangible, then that's where we'll find our heart. He says, if the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. If your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Now today we think of an evil eye as somebody who's giving you a stank eye, I mean, that's the evil eye in our thinkings today. But back in the Jewish culture in the first century, an evil eye was referred to someone who was obsessively covetous and envious. If somebody was always looking at the riches of somebody else, if somebody was looking at what somebody else had and thinking, I wish I had that, and you had a poke in the eye, they would say to that person, you're giving him the evil eye. When we would look covetously or envious on somebody else. And, someone who compulsively sought his own way and success, even if it meant to the exclusion of other people. That was the evil eye. And this is what Jesus is talking about here in this section. In reality, it just simply referred to the state of fallen man taken to its logical conclusion, right? If somebody does not have the Holy Spirit, if somebody is not serving the Lord, then why not be that way? Why not go for the gusto? Why not try to get everything you can regardless of how you get it? Because why not? After the flood, this is kind of interesting to me. After the flood, there were 8 people on earth. When they came out of the ark, there was Noah and Mrs. Noah, there was Ham and Mrs. Ham, there was Shem and Mrs. Shem, and there was Japheth and Mrs. Japheth. 8 people. That's all the human beings there were on the world, on the entire planet, that were still alive. And every one of them was a monotheistic Yahweh worshiper. Right? That's why they made it onto the ark. And within 2 generations, Ham had a son named Cush, and then Cush had a son went by the name of Nimrod. And within 2 generations of the post-flood people, the world had degraded into polytheistic idol worshipers. In just 2 generations. And that's, the Nimrod and his people on the plain of Shinar, they tried to build this tower going up to heaven. It was probably the very first ziggurat. You see the ziggurat ruins throughout all of the Middle East, especially in the Tigris and Euphrates area. In fact, you see versions of that all over the planet. A lot of them you see in South America from the Aztecs and Incas. And as man started building these pyramid-like structures called ziggurats, it was an attempt to elevate man to godlike status. It said they were building a tower up to heaven. They didn't really actually think that they could just build this tower and they keep, putting another layer of bricks on it, another story on it, another height to it until one day they got all the way up past the stars into heaven. They weren't thinking in those kind of terms. I think even in their primitive states, they knew better than that. But they were trying to elevate themselves to what we would call godlike status. And I think that can be demonstrated through, as we look just a little bit of study of anthropology, or what we could maybe look at as the evolution of idolatry. In the beginning, back on the plain of Shinar, let's say, after the passing of Noah and his sons, and then the majority of the descendants were doing what Nimrod and all of his people did. They looked up and they saw the sun. They were godless people. They'd left God in the rearview mirror, and they'd look up at the sun and they'd see the sun and they would worship it. They worshiped the sun. and the moon and the stars and, the various other things. Now, they would look at an object and they'd be in awe of the object that they would look at, and then they would worship it, thinking that must be a deity, that must be God. And then in passage of time, it passed from being where they would worship the God, where they would have the sun god. There was a God that controlled the sun. There was a God that made the sun, and he was the one that controlled the sun as he rose in the mornings and set in the evenings, and they would worship the sun god. And then when we go a few generations, a few cultures later, we get into Egypt. Of course, they were big sun god worshipers. And we look at Ra, the sun god, one of the sun gods of Egypt. And Ra had this falcon-like head. And what does his body look like? Pretty ding-dong human, okay? And we go from the Egyptian religion, go through a few generations and a few cultures, and we get to the Greco-Roman culture, and then we see Helios, the sun god, and he looks like a man. He's a man in every way except he's pretty ripped. He's a pretty good man to look at. Very flawed. All the Greco-Roman gods had their issues because they were like men. And from there, it got to where this whole cycle of it continued on. We go through the Roman period, and then there was the Dark Ages, and then as we started coming out of the Dark Ages, there was what's known as the Enlightenment movement and the Renaissance, and there were all of these great artists and philosophers and writers and thinkers and so forth. And all of that period, I think, as man kind of came full circle in his search for self-deification, we see it manifested in Michelangelo's David, the big famous sculpture of David, where his head and his hands are largely out of proportion to the rest of the body. Because the thinking of the Enlightenment period during the Renaissance was, we got brains, and we're smart, and we got hands. We can think of stuff, and we can do stuff, because we're men. And in so doing, this whole came full circle of the deification of man. The ziggurat of man's heart came full circle and had him elevated, not in so many words at that time, but it became fully developed by the time we get into modern times, of the self-deification of men. In other words, the pluralistic pagan world of the first century is not too far removed from our own. And all this to say, I think all of this is to say that we will become whatever the object of our focus is. And that's what Jesus meant when he says that where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. If my focus is going to be on my treasure, my focus is going to be on my tangible wealth. If my focus is going to be on my planning for the future, then that's where my heart's going to be. If we focus on trivial pursuits, we'll become trivial people. I think if Jesus wanted to paraphrase himself, he would say something along those lines. For no one, he says in verse 24, can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. What is the inherent danger of money? I think at its most fundamental element, riches seem to promise provision. If we got a lot of money, then that seems to promise that we'll be well taken care of. We'll be well planned for. And it can happen if that's where our focus is. Greed and avarice notwithstanding, at the very least, riches tend to foster an independence from a providing God. And again, don't get me wrong, I've got investments for my future. They're much more important to me at 74 than they were when I was 24. I can guarantee you that. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not where our trust needs to be. My investments can be gone tomorrow. And then what? You know, if this is true, that just setting the greed and covetous lusting, setting all that part aside, and just looking at investments, finances, physical provision, focusing on that, if that can tend to lead me into foster an independence from God, then if I buy a new car, move into a bigger house, or look for a higher paying job, am I serving mammon? When Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. Am I serving mammon if I do that? Could be. You know, could be. The word serve here is the verb form of the word doulos. It's douluo, and it's the verb form of that. The word doulos occurs throughout the New Testament. New King James usually translates it as a bondservant. This would be used as an analogy. It's used to refer to the disciple of Jesus who has said, "I want to be bounded to you. I'm going to be your bondservant from here on out." And there was a whole tradition that was culturally surrounded by that, but they use that term to refer to the individual that has said, "Okay, Lord, I bow to you. You are my God. You are my Lord. I will follow you from here on after." And the New Testament uses the term doulos to refer to that person. And so where he says you cannot serve God and mammon, the word serve there is the verb form of that, douluo. The word mammon it's an Aramaic word, which is probably the native language of Jesus and the Jews of the first century, mammonos, and it means it's worldly wealth personified, would be one way of thinking of it. It's kind of like, it's not just simply, it's like if they want to personify their bank account, they would think of it in those sort of terms. They speak to their bank account as though he were their best friend, mammonos. Now, Timothy says in 1 Timothy 6, verse 10, he says, "For the love of money is root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." For the love of money is the root of all evil. He's not talking about, it's not money that's the root of all evil. We can see throughout the Old Testament where God would bless those who trusted in him. He would bless them with tremendous wealth. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's the love of money, Paul says, is the love of all the evil. It doesn't say money is the root of all evil. It doesn't say that money is the root of all the evil. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And it's because of the love of money that it has caused many to stray from the faith. There are some things that are just plain wrong. Always. It's wrong to steal. It's wrong to lust. It's wrong to murder. It's wrong to covet. It's wrong to be prideful, etc. Those things are wrong. They're listed as don't do these things in the Bible. Other things can become wrong based upon what our focus to them could be, how we pursue them. Money would be one thing. Money is not wrong in and of itself, but it can become wrong if that's something that we pursue. Money, hobbies, entertainment, social media, job. Those things are not wrong in and of themselves, but they can become that if that's where our focus becomes, right? in other words, it's a matter of the heart. I cannot covet with the right heart. That's a contradiction in terms. If I covet, my heart's wrong. So there's no way that you can make coveting good. But I can't murder with the right heart. Murder, not necessarily taking, and there's different reasons why you could take another person's life, but murder, the Ten Commandments says that you shall not murder, not that you shall not kill. And I can pursue a hobby with the right heart. I can get engaged, involved in golfing. I can take that up as a hobby, and I can do it with the right heart. But if I become obsessed with it, that I always want to just, get a better handicap. I want to lower my score. I start spending, because golfing ain't cheap, and you can spend all your money on golfing, whether it's equipment or the courses, whatever. Your wife can become a golf widow. It can become wrong. Nothing wrong with golfing. It's a good hobby, it's good exercise, but it can become wrong depending upon how we focus on it, right? It becomes wrong when I put that pursuit, whatever it might be, over and above the needs of the other people in my life, or even above my own spiritual needs. So that's 1 Timothy 1:6 says or 6:10 says that it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. A few verses later, in verse 17 of 1 Timothy chapter 6, he says that God gives us richly all things to enjoy. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's read the whole verse. That's what that means. Just read the whole verse. Don't just take that out of it. The whole verse says, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy." It's got a whole other meaning when you put the whole verse in there, right? Context means everything. And I think to sum it up, it's just, if we look at just get ahead of ourselves to what the verse that we're going to look at next week, one of the most well-known verses in all of Matthew, in chapter 6, verse 33, where Jesus says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness," and then all these things that he's talking about in chapter 6. Everything from verse 1 to verse 32, all these things, he says, will be added to you. And the reason why this verse is so well known, and I've used it a lot in counseling over the years, the reason why this verse is so well known is because it's got so many applications. But we'll save it for next week and expound on it more then. So let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you. Oh, God, we thank you for you are a good God. You care for us. You provide for us. You are Jehovah Jireh. You are the God who provides. And sometimes we lose sight of that because we want to look at your provision as something that we dictate, something that we believe, the standard that we think should be proper. And then we get disillusioned when you think that there's other things that are more important that you want to teach us. And God, help us just to rest in you. Help us to, that you are the God who provides. You are a good God. And we can always trust you. And just help us, teach us, Lord, to, yes, we need to, it's wisdom to prepare, but it's folly to let that preparation take our eyes off of you. And so help us to learn that, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.